Hi, I'm Ross Grieve and I'm here to take you through settings and exposure demystify. So I'll sort of go through those terms that you're not too sure with to get you on the road to understanding photography a bit better. And if we've got time, we'll also pop in a few terms you may not have heard of before. So you'll hear about the magic triangle quite a bit. What is it? It contains ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, and that gives you your results that can create your exposure to give the correctly exposed image. So here is the exposure triangle or the magic triangle. There's all different variations of this available if you Google it. So one side is going to be aperture, your depth of field or blur in an image if you want to call it that. Shutter speed, which will either freeze or allow a slow shutter, which will allow some blur into it as well. And ISO, which is the sensitivity on your sensor or the film rating on a film, whether it's a fast film or if it's a slow film for studio or a fast film for dark situations. So what other factors are also going to influence your photography? Well, is the way you hold your camera. Try and think of a 3-point fix. So your eye, your hand on your lens, and the camera grip where your trigger is, and that'll give you a nice stable camera 3-point fix. So if you need to shoot in dark situations, that will help. Composition will come along as you learn, but always don't look just down the middle of the camera. Run your eye around all 4 corners so you can sort of improve on your composition, and that will improve. Look at interesting angles, the way you shoot, whether it's down low or up high, and different perspectives to sort of tell your story and reflect your style. Understand what you're photographing as well, and try and bring that across in your photography. And most important, understand light, and just go outside in your street and look at the pavement, how the light's hitting it, the walls, everything, and you'll get a really good understanding, because if you go to the same point each day, that light will change each day as well. ISO. So what is ISO and what does it mean? ISO is the International Organization of Standardization, or as films used to be called, ASA. Now what that is the rating or the speed of the film, or if you're shooting digital cameras, which we all do now, that is a whole film shop in your camera. So that is the sensitivity of your sensor by having that down low at ISO 50 or up at say 6400 ISO, which is really sensitive, which is going to let in more light. And if you let in more light and make your sensor more sensitive, you may introduce some grain at that point. So let's have a look at that. So this is the Burj out in Dubai. I was on the beach shooting for a client, and I actually left my tripod in the room, so I really had to crank up the ISO in order to freeze everything. I could have had a lower ISO maybe if I'd had a tripod, but this actually worked out really, really well. So you can see a little bit of grain above the group of people, and that's purely because the ISO is quite high. You can obviously go higher than that if you choose to, and if we just zoom in, you can see where the grain is there. Now, I don't mind grain in my photos. That doesn't bother me at all. I have no issues with that whatsoever. So it's up to you and your style on how you want to have grain or noise. Also black and whites, I think black and white with grain or noise in it looks really, really good. So how does ISO affect you and what you do? Well, if we're outside, say at the Burj, I'm just reliant on the available light here. I can't add a flash into that because it'll just kill the photo. It'll look horrendous. I want to get the ambient light and use that. Whereas on the right, if I'm in the studio, say photographing a pet or a portrait, I've got full control of the light, and that means I can have full control over the camera and my ISO. I'm not so influenced on what ISO I choose. So that means I can shoot at ISO 400 and have a nice image with no grain in there whatsoever. And if I convert that to black and white, I get a beautiful, crisp image, which the client is very happy with. Likewise, I can shoot portraits at ISO 400. A lot of people may want to shoot lower. It's entirely up to you on what you shoot at. It's your photography, but just practice on what you do so you'll get a really good idea on how to change your ISO, use your camera, and get used to that sensor sensitivity. Remember, a low ISO is not going to be so sensitive, and you're going to have very little grain, if any. And if you go up higher, that's when the grain becomes introduced. So we look at this one here. This is ISO 125, and the client was just leaving the studio and she put her jacket on. I said, put that back, come back over here and we'll take a photo, because it looks absolutely amazing. So even those opportunities, just grab, take it again. When you're out with friends and stuff and you're playing Jenga randomly and you want to get some photos and you're just going by the light that's in the pub, ISO 1600, and it's got a nice little bit of grain in there, and I really like that sort of documentary style feel, which happens when you shoot black and white and you introduce a grain into it. Now you look at this one, which is 800, and we go to the previous. I prefer the 1600 just because it's got that little bit more grain in it. So let's just refresh your mind a little bit on how the exposure triangle works. So ISO, if we're down in 100, is nice and smooth, or 50, and we go up to 6400, that's when you're going to start introducing noise. But don't be afraid of that. It will have some creativity for you as well. So if we carry on again, out in the street, I'm reliant on the ambient light around me. So my ISO is 400, and I'll bang on and I'll show you lots of photos as well. So that knowledge gets installed into your head as well. Here we have ISO 200, so I get the detail of the temple and the nice reflections on the water. And this is purely put in there because it's my cat and Lola. And this is actually shot in 6K, but maybe we'll come on to that another time. Mistakes also happen as well. So normally I shoot in the studio 400, 125 or 200, and I have been out shooting outside and my ISO was still at 800, and I shot this and I actually really liked how it's worked out. Yes, granted, the kicker on the side of the head is a little bit hot, but I really like the high contrast, and that's because of the high ISO. So sometimes it can work in your favor. When you're shooting press, I tend to work with a high ISO, and I'll just pop on a little bit of flash. I prefer it that way, rather than working with a low ISO and then blasting them with flash, which is really unsettling when you're photographing people. If you're going to shoot astro as well, you've got to make that a sensor very sensitive, so it's going to draw in as much detail as possible. Hence, this is 3200 ISO. And then if we crank it up to 6400 ISO on the same location, the ambient light from the town over the other side of the hill starts filtering through. So you can see how sensitivity of your sensor and rating your ISO higher, not just grain, but can let in more light to the sensor. And this was shot in 6K. So what happens in video, video sensitivity, noise comes in a lot sooner with your ISO rating than it will with still. So if I say shoot in 1000 ISO on a still and I shoot 1000 ISO in video, that video is more than likely to have a little bit more noise than would be on a still. So ask yourself, how well is the subject lit? Will the noise grain be acceptable? What kind of lights are available? Natural, ambient, because that can add warmth and depth to an image. Do you need a glass of wine? Yes, you do when you think about these sort of things. But if you're outside, do you need permission to photograph? Because you could be on private property. So just think of those things as well when you're out there shooting. Aperture. Now let's have a look how that's going to influence your exposures. So again, we look at the exposure triangle, look at our depth of field, and that's the simplest way is the amount of blur that you've got in your shot. So if you imagine your eye, and if it's really dark, your eye opens right up. So a large aperture is actually a small number, so which is like around f2.8. If it's really bright, your eye is going to go like a pinhead, and it's going to be like a small aperture, which is f22. So aperture is depth of field, which again is that separation between the subject and what's behind them. You hear about fast and slow lenses. Fast and slow lenses is with a wide open aperture, so like a 2.8 or faster. Some even have 1.2. Now those are more expensive lenses. A slow lens is classed maybe a 5.6, but those are okay to start out with, so don't let that bother you. So what is aperture? Aperture can ensure the whole image is sharp or the distracting background behind is blurred. You'll see it a lot, say in the image here of Shauna. So this is She's shot about f4, and she's just about a meter in front of the background, but I've lit her so there's just got that little bit of separation, a little bit of light spill in the background. Now if I wanted that background sharp as well, I'd maybe look at shooting about f8, f11. And here's a full example. So 2.8 is wide open and you get the blur. f22 is a small aperture and everything is going to be sharp, which maybe a landscape photographer would do, say maybe about f11, f16. Here is an example of the clients I shot recently, and behind you can see the background of the trees is just slightly blurry because I wanted that separation for them. And it's worked out really, really nicely. So we've got the separation, they love the shot. And you can also, this is a classic example of the rule of thirds. So if you split that photo into 9 separate blocks all over the photo, yeah, so there's a third at the bottom, they're in the middle third, and the top third has got the trees behind. Now this is a bit of trickery as well. I've actually blurred the shoulders post, but because I shot this about f5.6 and I just wanted a bit more fall off on the shoulders, so I added that in post-production. So also if you're looking at photos like this, look at the eyes to see how it's lit. That's a good idea. It's a good way to get an idea on how it's lit and maybe how you can practice and learn from that as well. Now this is Ebony running towards me. She was shot at 1.2. Because I needed a really fast aperture because I wanted a high shutter speed and it was shot using continuous lights. So her tail was blurry, her ears are blurry, so what is sharp is her nose and her eyes, and that's all I really wanted pin sharp because that's your focal point. So we're talking about separation with subjects as well. So the floor is blurry, the background is blurry, but the subject there is nice and sharp. And again, this is shot about f4. So we get that nice detail in there. There's no grain or anything like that, but we've got the separation from. Apart from this one, when the people are just in the train station and I want to get detail of what's behind them. So this is shot at about f8. So I've got everyone sharp, I've got the detail of the railings behind, and also I've got no control over the lighting as I do in the studio. This is a shot of Emily Sande, and I wanted her to be in the main focus against the background there, but I wanted to include the piano player. So what I've done, I've shot that about 2.8. So he is just slightly blurred in the background and the piano is softer, but Emily is absolutely pin sharp, and that just brings the photo together better, because if she was on her own, I don't think it would be as much as a dynamic photo with her piano player in the background. Now this is Susanna. She's a Swedish soprano, which I did a CD cover for. And I wanted to get all the detail in her face. She had beautiful eyes and her hair and everything like that. But it's quite a good way to look at it because you see the pose, which I asked her to do, but if her shoulder is actually falling off in the background. This is shot about f4. So we've got that beautiful fall off, but everything in the face is just sharp. So the fall off is on the back shoulder, everything at the front is sharp. And when you're shooting and you've got one subject, you're fine, because you can experiment a bit with your aperture. So you can either just get the face sharp, or you can get the boxing gloves. As you notice in this one, the boxing gloves aren't pin sharp, but the eyes are sharp, and that's really important in your portraiture. I've just shot this on its own, but if you shoot with a group, you need to have everyone sharp. So an example here, ISO 200, shot at f8 and 1/25th of a second because we're using flash in the studio. So if this was shot at say 1.2 or 2.8 and there was a slight movement of one of the subjects backward or forward, then they may be slightly soft or out of focus. So if you, by shooting at f8 and focusing on the dad, for example, and everyone's in the same sort of plane, then everyone's going to be sharp. Say also if someone was further behind, then they would also be sharp. So that's what you want to consider when you're shooting your group photos. Here I've used aperture to create depth in the photo. So the model is the first thing you see. Then we've got the leading lines going down. We've got the plane, and we've got on the jetty as well, and then the sunset at the back. So everything sort of falls in, but you've got to be led into that photo, and that's just by using aperture. And a similar sort of thing is with depths and leading lines in this photo, looking right down at an airport, gentleman walking through the shot, but you can see in the background that the time on the boards, you can see it's 7:27 in the morning for an early flight, absolutely pin sharp. So let's have a look at shutter speed. Back to our exposure triangle, Shutter speed, is it all about action or is it about creating drama? Well, let's have a look. The uses of shutter speed are only limited by your creativity. And we've talked about slow lenses, but let's talk about dragging the shutter. I do that a lot with my street photography, and it just means a slow shutter speed. And it can be really practical and really, really effective. So what is the shutter speed? It's quite simply the time the shutter is open to expose the sensor or film. But there are two types of shutter now, mechanic and electronic. And with an electronic, you can get a rolling shutter because the pixels will turn off, running down it to expose, whereas a mechanical or total shutter will open the shutter and it will expose everything behind it. Now what happens with the mechanical shutter is quite interesting. Because you get this banding going on, and you can have an electronic shutter, if you shoot about 1/100th of a second, you should be okay. Whereas with a mechanical shutter, you won't get that banding or rolling shutter. And also a nice little experiment, if you spin around a coin, you'll see how it'll bend with an electronic shutter, but with a mechanical shutter, you'll absolutely freeze it. With a surfer or sports, you can be quite creative. With a surfer, you want to freeze that action because it's going to be a pretty pointless exercise photographing a surfer with a slow shutter speed. He's just going to be blurred in that movement. But then you can also just quickly grab a photo and make a quick street shot using a fast shutter speed. So there's different applications and how they can be used. Or with your street photography, you can create life and drama into it by just dragging that shutter and just blurring people, and also adds a bit of anonymity to it as well. But if you're shooting static objects or architecture or whatever, you're not so influenced by your shutter speed unless someone's going to walk through it and you really want a long exposure, say with internal photography, which is really interesting, but otherwise you're not so influenced as with people moving about. When you shoot street, you get to add that drama with using shutter speed, and here is how. So with the train zooming past, I've slowed the shutter speed down because all the commuters are not moving, so they are going to be still. So I can just make that photo much more interesting by slowing that shutter down to about 1/15th of a second, and it looks really good. Same with this, when isolating the person in the middle of the photo, if I drop it down and isolate them, it looks much more appealing. Same with the girls here, I asked them to stand still, and then I shot this at 1/5 of a second, everyone whizzing by, you can see a slight bit of movement in them, but otherwise it's a great effect to use. So just have another look at the exposure triangle, get out there and practice, but most of all, enjoy your photography and learn from your photography, and don't be afraid of your mistakes because that's how you learn the most. Good luck and enjoy it out there.